Hey everyone, Sam here. Thanks for joining me. I hope you're having a beautiful day wherever you are in the world. So this video follows on from my previous video that I made where I was using an iPad and Procreate in order to design a composition for a painting. And for any of you that watched this video, I showed you a mountain scene that I designed using my iPad with an Apple Pencil, and I made this a value study, so it was in black and white, pretty much like using a sketch pad and pencils, but just on my iPad. So now that I've designed the composition, I'm now ready to paint a colour study. So this is a small painting where I'll decide if it's going to work and if I like the colours. And from that, that's where I'll do a larger painting. And I probably will do a larger painting of this scene. I haven't decided yet, but I probably will. But in this video, I'll show you the process of painting this colour study. So I hope you enjoy this video. Sit back, relax, and let's roll the tape. I'm painting on a 6" by 12" linen panel, and I made this linen panel myself. What I did was I ordered a roll of medium weave oil primed linen and then cut it down to size. I then mounted it to some craft ply, which I cut to size, and I got this from my local hardware store. Now I like using the pre-made panels as well because they're really easy to use and no bother. But sometimes it's cool to make your own because it saves you a bit of money, and you can also make them to the size you want. So I'm using oil paint here, but you could also use acrylic, and what I start doing is I begin sketching out the composition. I'm using burnt sienna mixed with Liquin Original, and Liquin's the medium I'm going to be using in the painting. It helps to speed up the drying time and it improves the flow of the paint. It's very good if you want to get lots of paintings done quickly. Now overall this is just a colour study, so I don't want to spend too long on this anyway. The fast drying time of the Liquin is really advantageous. Now once I've sketched out this composition, the first thing I think about is where are all my dark values and shadows that are in the scene that I'm painting. Values, values, values. So value is how light or dark a subject is. If you've watched a load of my other videos, you'll hear me say this in each of my videos, so it might get a bit repetitive, but I find personally I learn best from repetition. So the advantage of painting our dark values first is that we can create quickly a tonal dynamic in the painting. So we'll have our darkest darks and our lightest lights in the foreground, and then as landforms recede into the distance, darks are not as dark and lights are not as light, and this is because the value scale narrows. The value scale is represented where you have white at one end and black at the other end, and it progressively gets darker, so in the middle you've got a load of greys and midtones. So I keep this in mind when I start a painting, and here I've started with the clouds, which they are quite light shadows actually, because clouds and skies are generally some of the lighter values to be found in the landscape, but I still include these with the shadows. I mix these shadows with ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, just a tiny amount of alizarin crimson and titanium white. I edge the mixture more on the blue side so it's got a subtle blue cast to it, and so that the colour doesn't look like a muddy grey. And I block these in with a number 5 flat brush. Now here's a good point to just quickly talk about the brand of oil paint I'm using. I'm using a brand called Blue Ridge Oils, and they're a company that are based in North Carolina in the USA. This is an artist quality oil and really beautiful to paint with. Now when painting with oils or even with acrylics, I think it's always best to stick to one brand of paint. When it comes to painting with oil paints, even if you've never used oils in your life, I would always recommend from the get-go using an artist quality oil. Your whole painting experience will just be so much better, and the paint will actually go further. Now it is true that some of these paints can be a little bit expensive, but I usually find the more expensive colours last a lot longer than the cheaper colours such as ultramarine blue and titanium white. These are colours I tend to use a lot more of in all of my paintings. Now if you want to get your hands on some Blue Ridge oil colours, I've put a link in the description box below. And as I say, I'd totally recommend this brand of oil paints. Now when it comes to painting the mountain shadows, those distant mountains are going to be much lighter than the shadows in the mountains in the foreground. But I also want to maintain the colour harmony within the painting as well, and the way we can do this is to use common colours where possible throughout the painting. So I'm actually going to use the same colours for the mountain shadows that I used in the clouds, but with less titanium white, which is going to make it darker. So again, ultramarine blue, burnt sienna, tiny amount of alizarin crimson and some titanium white. I've used this same colour combination with the other mountain shadows as I work forward in the painting, but using less and less titanium white to make the shadow mix darker, until we'll have some of our darkest shadows which are in the foreground. So once I've painted in the main areas of shadows, you can quickly see there's already a tonal dynamic in the painting. And that's going to make it much easier to create atmospheric depth, as well as get the saturation of my colours correct as well. In general, the colours in the distance are going to be low in chroma, or desaturated. There are a few exceptions of course. Skies can certainly be reasonably high in chroma, but in general we're going to be using lower chroma colours for the distant landforms. If I was to use really saturated colour in the distance, it would bring those mountains forward in the painting and we'd lose that atmospheric depth completely. So next here I'm going to work on the clouds, working back in the landscape and coming forward, and I mix some titanium white with a little bit of burnt sienna, and I allow that shadow mix to mix in as well. I actually want to keep the white of the clouds and any other areas of white in the painting, especially on the mountain highlights, a bit darker, so that when I come to the next session on this painting, I can more sparingly layer in some highlights onto the mountain, and that will add to the three-dimensional form and just make them look alive. So with all my paintings I build it up and then I save the lightest values until the very end. I paint the areas of snow on the mountains that are in shadow, and again using the same colours I used in the clouds. Although I've used a little less ultramarine blue in the mix just to make it more of a grey. Most of the mountains are in shadow with some spotlighting effects on the snow in the distance. I paint the sky with a mix of titanium white, ultramarine blue and a little bit of phthalo green, and that just adds a richness to the blue. So obviously just a moment ago we were talking about desaturating colours so we can make them low chroma. And this is now going to be especially important when I come to paint the distant vegetation on the lower sections of the mountains. I've got to create a really desaturated green, and I mix ultramarine blue with a small amount of yellow ochre and a lot of titanium white. And on my palette it will look like a muddy warm grey, but when placed next to the blue of the mountain shadows it will have more of an appearance of green. As I work forward in the painting and paint the sides of the mountains that are in the full sunlight, I'm going to be increasing the saturation of the green that I'm using, as some of those trees are illuminated in the sun, and because it's closer the chroma is going to be increasing. So I'm still using the same colours that I used for those distant greens, but I increase the saturation by mixing in more ultramarine blue and yellow ochre, and even a little bit of phthalo green as well. There's still some titanium white in the mix, because I need to make sure that the values and the colour are in keeping with the surrounding shadows. The green of the vegetation of these mountain slopes that are more towards the foreground are going to be much higher in chroma. So I'm still using ultramarine blue and yellow ochre, but I'm increasing the saturation by mixing in some cadmium yellow. So that really gives that green a boost. Now I still want to make it look natural and organic, so you can mix in a colour to harmonise the green with something that contains red, because red is opposite to green on the colour wheel. So in this case I added a little bit of cadmium orange to the green. I'm still making sure that green is quite dark, because trees and bushy kind of vegetation are generally some of the darkest values to be found in the landscape. Now I also wanted to create some textures and different tones within the green, so I've also mixed in other colours, such as, instead of cadmium orange, mixing in some burnt sienna for example. As I say, it just helps to take the saturation out of the green and just harmonise it and make it look more natural. And this is especially a good idea if your green's looking a bit neon or artificial. I also keep in mind the other colours I've been using elsewhere in the painting so I can try and maintain the colour harmony that will make the painting read better to the viewer. Now, it's often the case with mountain landscapes that you get areas where there's mountain grass or areas that have been dry for a while where the vegetation is low in chroma, and this is definitely the case with this grass that I'm now painting here in the foreground. I mixed the colours for the grass using yellow ochre, burnt sienna and titanium white, and I can also mix in a little bit of ultramarine blue if I just want to take out the saturation a bit. The burnt sienna is actually a dark orange, and also when it's combined with the yellow ochre it's definitely making an orangey colour, so if I want to desaturate it, mixing in some ultramarine blue is going to do that because blue is opposite to orange on the colour wheel. I also mix in titanium white because that keeps the value light and it also helps to desaturate the colour as well. Now, once I've added these main areas of colours, I then started to add some details to some of the areas within the painting. Not too much because I'll be able to add more once it's dry, but just certainly tidy it up and restate some of the dark values. When I paint the mountain highlights, I use the same mix that I used for the cloud highlights, which was titanium white with some ultramarine blue, burnt sienna and a little bit of alizarin crimson. But I've used a lot more titanium white. I then mark in some of the highlights on the mountains where the full sun's illuminating it. And if you remember earlier, I said I was going to keep the value a bit darker so that at the end of the painting I can layer on those final highlights, and that will make the mountains look more realistic. For the track that's heading towards the mountains in the distance, and for the silt and stones and mountain scree that's in the floodplains around the river, I've again used a neutral grey colour, the same colours that I used for the cloud shadows. I finish up the blocking in stage, or this initial painting session, by just marking in a few shrubs and bushes that are in the midground. I let the painting dry and then I came back to it for another painting session where I was going to add some more details and some highlights to it. Once I'd let the painting dry, I then just focused on adding a few details to it so that I could finish off the painting. So I spent one more session on it. So what I did here was I added more highlights to the clouds, and this was mainly a mix of titanium white with a little burnt sienna. And seeing as I'd had that white mix already mixed up for the cloud highlights, I also used that same mix to paint some highlights on the mountains. And I know I said I saved my lightest values until the end, but this was kind of like the last session on this painting anyway, and I thought seeing as I'd mixed up the colour for the clouds right there, I might as well just carry on using it. I spent much of the remainder of the painting just building up the form on the side of the mountains. So these were the shadow areas, again using the same colours that I used during the block-in stage, so a mix of ultramarine blue with burnt sienna, alizarin crimson, just a small amount, and titanium white. Now, as I said, these are a great colour combination for shadows because you can use them for clouds, mountains, rocks, hills, shadows, all sorts of things. You can create some really nice neutral greys with this colour combination, so this is my go-to colour combination. I use this mix to paint some of the things like the exposed rock faces on the distant mountains and on the mountains in the midground and foreground, keeping in mind the value and how light or dark it is. The values still have to be in keeping with whatever position in the landscape they're in, so those distant shadows are going to be much lighter than the shadows that are nearer the foreground. I also added some more layers to the trees that are on the side of the mountains in the midground, essentially using the same colours but making sure that the value is a little bit lighter than the previous layer just to build up a bit of texture within them. And then I also worked on the vegetation on the mountain slopes that are nearer the foreground. The colour combination's mainly centred around a mix of yellow ochre with cadmium yellow and some ultramarine blue. I adjust the value with titanium white and I get some of those different tones in there by mixing in colours such as a little cadmium orange or burnt sienna or even alizarin crimson. This just knocks back the green as they all contain red, and red is opposite to green on the colour wheel. I found that a number 3 filbert brush is good for painting types of vegetation here that are on the side of the mountain, as you can use the broad end of the brush and also the rounded edge of the brush for the more finer marks. I wanted to add a bit more contrast and shadow to the grassy areas in the foreground just to emphasise the background mountains a little bit more. Now I've actually used the same colours that I used for the grass overall, and this is mostly a mix of yellow ochre with burnt sienna, ultramarine blue and titanium white, but I've used a lot more ultramarine blue and burnt sienna in my mix and much less titanium white to create a darker value. I then painted some darker areas within the path in the foreground, and I also added some highlights to the water that's in the midground. I then finished up the painting by just adding a few final details to the mountains overall and just refining their shapes. Now, as I said, I didn't spend too long on this painting, just a couple of sessions, and it's mostly the colours and values that I wanted to get an idea of. But anyway, with this small colour study, if I decide to do a bigger version of this, which I think I probably will do, I can use this colour study to refer to when I come to paint the larger version. And it definitely helps to do a colour study if you're going to get into a larger painting, because you can see already if the painting is going to work or not, or if there's any things that you need to fix. But it was here that I decided to call this painting finished. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, be sure to give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. Also share this video as well, as it all helps with the YouTube algorithm, however that works. As I say, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you'd like to learn more about painting landscapes, then check out my Patreon channel where I've got loads of in-depth painting tutorial videos, and I bring out a full-length painting tutorial every month. Plus you get access to all my other painting tutorial videos as well, so it's like a landscape painting course. And there's also my website where I've got loads of free content, written painting tutorials, and also I have full-length painting tutorial videos for sale there as well. So one of the things you can do, if you like this video, leave me a comment and let me know if you'd like me to paint a larger version of this. I know I've said this with quite a lot of my other videos where I've just been painting smaller paintings, and I am actually working on doing some larger artworks as well, so I'll be keen to hear your thoughts. So I hope you're having a beautiful day, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.